Okay, so there's been a huge trade announcement from the US president about India, and it stirred up a ton of conversation. It was rolled out as this massive, game changing breakthrough. But the reaction on the other side, well, let's just say it's a lot more complicated. So let's get into it and try to separate what's real from what's just ambition. It really all kicked off with this one very bold statement from President Trump. The claim was pretty simple, and you have to admit, very powerful. A deal was done. Some of the world's toughest tariffs were getting slashed, hinting at this giant shift in the trade relationship between the US and India. But it didn't just stop with the tariffs. The announcement came with a few other bombshells. First, a commitment that India would stop buying Russian oil. Second, a promise to throw its markets wide open to American businesses. And third, a mind-boggling $500 billion shopping spree for US goods. I mean, on paper, that sounds like one of the biggest deals in modern history, right? But then we got the official response from India. And this is where our story gets really interesting, because it was, to put it lightly, a tale of two completely different statements. So what was the problem? Well, the main issue was this overwhelming sense of vagueness. You have this huge, grand announcement from the US, but the actual, concrete details of this so-called agreement, they were basically nowhere to be found. And that, of course, led to a whole lot of skepticism back in India. And look, this slide just lays out the disconnect so clearly. On the left, you've got the US hailing a major deal, but on the right, India's statement simply welcomes reduced tariffs. The US says India will stop buying Russian oil and drop $500 billion on US goods. India's statement? Total silence. Not a word on either point. In fact, the word deal isn't even mentioned. So, you have to ask yourself, what is actually going on here? To figure that out, we've got to unpack each of these claims one by one. And believe me, this is where we find the devil in the details. All right, let's start with the one thing both sides seem to agree on, at least in principle, the tariffs. What's the real story there? So, for some background, you gotta remember the US had previously put these really high tariffs on a lot of Indian goods. We're talking as high as 50%. And that was a serious barrier that was having a real impact on Indian companies and their ability to sell to the US. And here's the result. That 50% tariff wall has now been knocked down to 18%. This is the one piece of the announcement that seems to be undeniably real, and for Indian exporters, it's a pretty significant win. But why were those tariffs so high to begin with? Well, this chart explains it perfectly. For years, the US has had a big trade deficit with India. What that means is they buy way more stuff from India than they sell to India. So those high tariffs were really a tool to try and rebalance that relationship. Okay, so the tariff part makes sense. It checks out. But now, what about that second, much more explosive claim that India is going to stop buying Russian oil? This is where things get a little more complicated. See, a lot of experts point out that India has been acting as a swing buyer in the world oil market. By buying up Russian crude, often at a discount, they actually helped absorb a lot of supply and kept global prices stable for everyone. If they just stopped, it would create massive ripple effects. And that brings us to what is probably the most sensitive, most difficult part of any potential deal. This demand for India to open up its markets, especially when it comes to agriculture. And this chart, wow, it shows you exactly why this is such a huge deal. Almost half of India's entire population depends on agriculture to make a living. If you suddenly flood the market with cheaper foreign goods, it could be absolutely devastating for millions and millions of families. So you see, India's historically protectionist policies aren't just there for no reason. They're basically a shield. They protect sectors that are not quite as competitive on a global scale, and they support a huge number of small businesses and, most critically, the millions of farmers who really rely on that government's support to get by. Okay, so with all of this complexity, why the big flashy announcement right now? To get that, we need to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the whole geopolitical game board. And this timeline is really, really revealing. Right before the big US announcement, India was on a roll. They had just signed major trade deals with the European Union and another one with the UK. India was clearly out there making new friends and building new partnerships. And that leads some analysts to a really compelling theory. that this was basically a case of geopolitical FOMO, fear of missing out for the United States. They saw India creating these powerful new economic alliances, and they might have felt this urgent need to jump in and announce their own major deal, even if all the details weren't quite nailed down yet. So, where does all of this leave us? Let's try to bring it all together for the verdict. This is a classic story of massive ambition clashing with a very complex reality. Here's the bottom line. The tariff reduction, that's a real positive step forward. But the grand deal, as it was announced by the US, that remains mostly an ambition. Its future is totally unwritten because it's all pending official ratified texts that, well, they just don't exist yet. Now, the potential upside for India is huge, no question. A full deal could seriously boost trade and help put India on the path to becoming a fully advanced economy by 2047, which is its 100th anniversary. But potential is definitely the key word there. And that really just leaves us with one final question that gets right to the heart of this whole thing. In the high-stakes world of global trade, what ultimately matters more? The power and flash of a big public announcement, or the quiet, difficult, painstaking work of actually negotiating the fine print?